Well, I grew up in the bush in the central coast of New South Wales, and I basically watched the bush there degrade. And at 16 I left home and went to Newcastle to get a job and make my fortune, and I did pretty well. I was desperate to get a place to live that was like I grew up in. I wanted a bit of bush for myself. But the law had changed a fair bit by then, and it was, for example, illegal in New South Wales to do anything with native animals. And I searched around, and South Australia was the only state where it wasn't illegal to, well, own native animals. So I came to South Australia, got a job at Flinders University teaching mathematics. For me, that was a dream job, and that was to be my job for the rest of my life. I think I came here in January 1969. It was quite different when I came here. None of these trees were here. In fact, it was a dairy. But you could look down the valley, and down the bottom there was this dam, and it looked pretty good. And I thought, well, I could visualise what I could do with it. And so I bought it in June 1969 and started planting trees and things here, building habitats. It would be wrong to say I had any idea what I wanted to do. I just knew that I wanted to recreate basically somewhere where I could live and not go mad.
Feeling of this land, feeling of this land. Oh, 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 oh.
I don't know how many plants I planted on Warrawong because I stopped counting when I got to 50,000. I think I planted on my own one day, 4,000 in one day. The aim of my planting then was simply to, one, have a year-round nectar flow, and two, have all the habitats that the animals that once lived in the Adelaide Hills could live there on Warrawong. So that was my basic concept. That was the blueprint, if you like, of what we were doing.
When I planted them, I could visualise them one day being like this. And they are. Look at them now. They've even got hollows in them that birds can nest in and things, and possums can live in, and they're just wonderful. And the creek system's wonderful.
So the swamp was a big hit with everyone that came. We used to have mud fights in it and all sorts of things.
The idea was the swamp because I noticed that the foxes and cats here were a problem. And so I built the swamp, had islands in the swamp. I thought, well, the ducks can nest on the islands, but the foxes just swam out to them and ate the eggs. I planted a banksia patch down there, and there was a track from the neighbour's house over there down to the banksia patch where a cat used to come down each morning and have its breakfast. And so I decided the only thing you could do if you were going to do anything properly with wildlife in Australia was to build a fence, and so the big job started then. But when I did that, I didn't do it, I was never going to open to the public. Warrawong was built as a sanctuary for me, as well as the animals that were to come here.
The fence is 2 kilometres long. It was built completely by hand. There was no machinery used whatsoever. The holes were dug by hand. The concrete was mixed by hand. It took a year to build it, and it was the first successful fox and cat proof fence built in Australia anyway, and probably the world. And if anybody hadn't realised what I was doing, they'd have stopped me then, because the council could have put an order on it to stop me, but they didn't. And Prue had to sit in the back of the truck making sure when the wire came out that it didn't tangle. So Shane was born while I was building the fence. He was the overseer of the project. Well, the fence is the most important single thing in Warrawong, and if we want to save Australia's wildlife, we have to build fences.
We're not talking about saving particular species, we're really talking about saving the whole community of living organisms. The important thing that Warrawong can show people is that there is a way to save our biodiversity. We don't have the worst record in the world because we don't know what to do. We have the worst record in the world because Australians don't wish to save their biodiversity. If they wish to, Warrawong and show them the way.
John Walmsley and his wife Prue Geddes are proof of the old adage that the impossible takes a while, but miracles just take a little longer. John and Prue have turned Warrawong, their my-law property in the Adelaide Hills, into a unique wildlife sanctuary. Experts said it couldn't and it shouldn't be done. But as Pat Hudson reports, John's proved them wrong.
They dubbed him the ratbag of the Onkaparinga Valley, this ex-academic with all his crazy ideas. All the so-called experts said it was folly to build this fence, but John had to exclude all the nighttime marauding poachers, the cats and the foxes. Despite all the advice, he went ahead anyway. His savings and a year's toil went into it. And fortunately for him, it worked.
Well, I don't know why it was so revolutionary to build fences. So to me, it was quite clear that you had a problem, you had foxes and cats with a problem, so you fence them out. And there's places you go and you listen to talks and they tell you it's impossible to fence out a fox. Well, you can fence out a fox. We proved it could be done.
It's a loose fence and animals don't like climbing loose wire. I actually reared 2 foxes to see what they could do and build a fence they couldn't get through.
And then came the big thing of restocking the place. This is the first of the rufous bettongs to come. And this is a potteroo. This is the first swamp wallaby to be released there. Shane was getting his own machinery to drive round to. By then he could keep up with me a bit better.
One of the animals I'd put back here was the paddy melons, and the paddy melons have an interesting story here because I grew up in the bush at Niagara Park. There were redneck paddy melons, and I used to get up at dawn to watch them on the forest fringe. I thought they were wonderful animals. Nobody could tell me what they were. I described them to my parents and they said, oh, they're probably bandicoots. And I said, yeah, but they hop. And they said, well, they're hopping bandicoots. And that was that. There was a closing down sale of a backyard zoo at Peterborough, and we went to it, Prue and I, and there in a cage was these paddy melons that I'd never thought I'd see again. And I built a pen over here for them because I hadn't quite finished the fence. There were still foxes here. And everything went well until they decided they didn't want to be in the pen anymore, and they broke out. And the male was down the bottom here, a fox had killed and half eaten, and the female was gone. I used to get over morning, go for a walk every morning to see how things were going. And I thought I caught a glimpse of the paddy melons down in the forest, in the rainforest down the bottom. And the next morning I took some slices of bread with me and I threw one over where I thought I'd seen this paddy melon. And out comes a paddy melon and eats the slice of bread. And so I threw another slice over there and another paddy melon came out. And it wasn't long before I was surrounded by paddy melons. There was a dozen of them around me there. So the female had had her young and she'd survived and they'd bred up and there was a colony. I just stood there surrounded by these paddy melons and it went through my head the thought, people had paid to look at this.
Warrawong is one of those rare places that captures the beauty of the Australian bush before the arrival of white man. Here, John Walmsley has made his home a haven for rare and endangered native animals.
I have great faith in animals themselves, and I believe that if you give animals that used to live here a bit of what they had 200 years ago, that they'll work it all out. How you going, all right? Is he a mate of yours, is he? It's a bit like when you go on Aboriginal land, you have an Aboriginal with you to watch over you. We always have a kangaroo comes with us. They're a different kangaroo each morning. They must nominate one, draw straws or something. Species aren't endangered because they're hard to breed. Species are endangered because something's gone wrong in the wild. Our problem with Australian animals is foxes and cats, and if we're going to save them, we have to develop safe areas for them, and that's what we're doing.
And so it's been a laboratory for me to work out just what could be done. And it's worked far better than I ever imagined, and now Warrawong is one of the showpieces for native animals in Australia.
It was Australia's top tourist attraction. It was the only place in the world where you can go and see a bilby. It was the only place in the world where you could go and see bettongs.
And the nocturnal walk here is the most special one. That's when we show off the full range of animals that live here.
I think perhaps the most powerful thing that we ever brought to Warrawong, apart from the fence and the success of the conservation that we did, was to educate. How do you take a group of the public and involve them in the environment?
Do you know anything? Have you heard anything about bettongs?
No.
Right.
That's the brush-tailed bettong. The brush-tailed bettong is probably the rarest of the living kangaroos. It's a real kangaroo and that's full grown. There would have been thousands of millions of them in Australia 200 years ago. 5 years ago there was less than 200 left in the world. And this would be the only viable breeding colony on mainland Australia now is here. 99% of Australians don't know bettongs exist, let alone get this close to them. Yeah.
That's how Homo sapiens evolved. They evolved into creatures that destroyed their patch. That's what we are. We destroy our patch. You can't change that. You can do a bit of education.
And every day the peace is broken by happy yells of classes of school children discovering nature firsthand.
Hey, you've got some stuff in there. Look at this. Put it in the sun here. Stand around. Let this in the sun. Let the sun shine on this, you see. And then you'll see what's in there.
John Walmsley is like a folk hero to these children, and his knowledge of the bush is seemingly bottomless.
The potteroo, that's the one with the long nose there, it's the most ancient of the living kangaroos. It's the same now as it was 10 million years ago. And 10 million years ago, all kangaroos were as small as that.
When you walked out into an environment, you had tall trees where you could hug them and listen to the sound of the inside of the tree. You had the nectar flow story of how the plants produce the nectar, but in many cases with Australian plants, the pollinating agent is the birds, not so much the insects. You had the story of black water in the Blackwater Lake. So at the end of an hour and a half's walk, you've totally immersed a group of people into a story that demonstrates an ecosystem as it's working. And that's powerful stuff.
It's as I remember the bushland from a boy, that the trees are there that used to be there and the whole range of animals that should be living here is living here. And that to me is very special. We do a lot of work with children, with school children. I believe that that's the best chance we've got of developing people that are sensitive to the environment in the future. We don't inherit this land from our parents, but we borrow it from our children. And that's my basic philosophy on life.
Is this what you'd do with your children? So he had a very interesting childhood. We had no option. His brother was a red kangaroo, and he had no option. All these animals just came into our lives, and we lived on site. We lived that experience. Where he thought that puppies were, they'd just left their mother's pouch. I seem to remember him saying once, didn't he? There's a puppy, and
he said, there's a puppy dog just out of its mother's pouch,
Sorry.
for example. And the other thing, when he started school, he used to ask the other kids what their kangaroos' names were, because he thought everyone had them.
Here we've got him hooked on the fence, so he's watching Cold Hole being built. I mean, he lived the life that we gave him. I mean, you do that with your children.
I had one of the best upbringings I imagine you could possibly have. I had 100 acres of natural bushland full of native animals that I spent all my time in. I could wander anywhere, anytime. I would spend just days wandering around. I also remember from ages 10 to 15, almost never walking on the floor, because we always had young wombats in the house, and at any opportunity they would bite you on the back of the heel really hard. So you would enter through the door, immediately climb onto the furniture and just walk across the furniture to get around the house. You'd never put your feet down unless you were absolutely sure you knew where they were and which direction they'd be coming from. That's their way of playing, and it was quite fun, but it was also quite destructive. Couldn't build anything, couldn't build a Lego structure or anything like that. There'd always be something to tear it down, but that was fun too. Well, this is Ace. This is Ace the quoll. He used to sleep in a little bag that hung around my neck, or that I tucked next to my head when I'd go to bed at night. And he'd wake me up by chewing on my ear. They've got incredibly needle-sharp teeth. Buster was my brother. Buster was a big red kangaroo, and he was big. I mean, I really don't know how big he was, but he seemed huge at the time. He was just absolutely enormous, and we used to spend a lot of time together, Guahia, the eagle. There's nothing like a full-grown wedge-tailed eagle when you're a little kid. They are huge and a lot of fun. One of his brothers, Chook, I think I used to ride like a small pony. We had a constant stream of animals in the house. I don't think I remember a time when we didn't have at least one rescue or injury that we were taking care of. We raised many animals. In fact, we raised many woylies, but there were two woylies that were mine to raise. They were Penny and Huffer. And Penny and Huffer slept in my bed, which wasn't a problem because they're nocturnal. So they'd get up at night and I'd sleep in the bed, and then during the day they'd sleep in the bed. And eventually, as they got older, they decided the bed was their nest, not mine. And we had some disagreements. There were a lot of fights, there was a lot of biting. I don't remember doing any of the biting, but I can't say now for sure that I wasn't involved. There was certainly a lot of kicking on both sides. And then eventually they had to go out. I won that battle, I got the bed. I didn't win all the battles. Sometimes I lost and they got to keep whatever we were fighting over. I remember always putting the creatures that we were looking after first in everything. If there was competition between putting the food that we wanted on the table or getting food for the animals, we'd get the food for the animals and then figure the rest out later, always. I didn't realise until I was an adult that my upbringing was as unusual as it was. I've suffered many injuries, but I have nothing but good memories.
Vanna was a spur-wing plover. He'd been rescued and hand-reared by somebody, and they gave him to us. He was sort of imprinted a bit to people, and he would come into the kitchen, he kind of ran the place. Later on, when we were doing nocturnal walks, he would come on every walk, and at every point where we would indicate that we were going to talk to the public, so we'd go, and here is, and out of the back of the group would come, and he would talk to the group, and every time you went to talk to the group, so he learnt to do nocturnal walks, he learnt to do any kind of walk.
He loved school groups. If you had a school group and you put them on a walk, he would make them walk in line. If anybody stepped out of line, he would put them back in line.
How would you do that?
By and scaring the hell out of them, telling them he was going to attack them, and he bluffed them basically because he had this terrible noise he'd make. And they used to listen to him, so he was a bit of a boss. He knew how to run a sanctuary, he reckons, and he would run it his way.
I don't know what the most popular animal was, but the icon here should have been the platypus. The platypus were absolutely fantastic. The platypus were important to me because it was the most difficult of them all to do, both from an approval to be able to do it, and by making it succeed. It's the most successful of the projects that I did here at Warrawong. Nobody had done what I did here. I went over to Kangaroo Island. I spent a fortnight sitting on the banks of the Rocky River watching platypus, because the only way you can understand platypus is to watch them. You don't understand them by reading a book. I came back and I built the Blackwater Lake to be exactly the same as one of the pools in the Rocky River. Had the same pH, the same plants growing in it, the same organisms living in the mud. And I went to Channel 7 and I asked Channel 7 if they'd like to sponsor this project because it was going to be hard. The idea was to catch the platypus, to put them in a helicopter, to fly them to here and put them in the pool.
The trip to Kangaroo Island is a realisation of 5 years' planning by John Walmsley. John's goal in life is simple. He wants to save rare native animals from extinction. Metre-high fishing nets were strung along one end of 3 different pools. The platypus team set off, armed for the long cold night ahead with blankets, port and a huge reserve of patience. Platypus are nocturnal animals, usually seen at sunrise or sunset. The best giveaway is the ripples they make when feeding on the river bank. By dusk, we had our first sighting of the shy mammal. These rare and exclusive pictures of a platypus in the wild were shot by Channel 7 cameraman Mark Whitaker. As darkness fell, all was quiet until midnight.
Oh no.
And it was extraordinary. Here's this platypus gets in the net, it's caught in the net, and this bloke that was an expert in catching platypuses out there, suddenly it went through his head, my God, these things have got poisonous spurs, haven't they? And he's poking it with his finger. I don't know what he was trying to do, but ultimately the platypus escaped and got away. So that's how he was going to catch the platypus. He was going to poke it into submission, I suppose. I don't know.
By sunrise, John and the other teams reported 2 near misses, but 2 platypus were definitely in the bag.
At 1:30 in the morning, there was this slight plop in the pool. I knew there was a platypus in the pool, and then it was in the net, and then I was in the water, and I wrapped it up in the net, and I had my platypus. Problem was, of course, I was soaking wet, and it was a freezing cold night, so I suffered a bit the rest of the night, but I had my platypus. I'd never caught a platypus in my life until then. I was terrified of it. I didn't know whether I could do it or not. Most of what I did, I didn't know whether I could do it or not. I've lived a life of terror in a way, I suppose.
John was able to work out he had 2 females on board. Packed safely in specially constructed release boxes, the 2 young ladies were given a one-way first-class ticket to the Adelaide Hills. Less than 12 hours after they'd been taken from the Rocky River, the 2 platypus arrived at Warrawong, no worse for wear.
I think it would have been a great relief to go into that nice cool water after an aeroplane and a helicopter and a bumpy ride in a car.
Now it just remains to be seen how well the platypus do in John's haven for rare Australian animals.
A year later, we went back and got 2 young males. I was the 2nd person in the world to breed one in captivity. But the South Australian National Park said very publicly to the world that all the animals at Warrawong are captive except the platypus, and they're in the wild, so they weren't bred in captivity, they were bred in the wild, and that's easy to do.
It always felt like we were at war, always. If we did it again now, in the 21st century, it would be a lot easier. I seriously don't think we would have to win anywhere near the number of battles that we had to win then to even get conservation recognised as a serious thing.
I knew that my methods worked. I knew that the Department of Environment was terrified of me. When public servants are terrified of you, you know you're on the right track, that you're doing them out of a job. And if you're doing public servants out of a job, you're doing a wonderful thing for Australia.
I believe very strongly that there is no place in Australia for cats.
At that time, it was illegal for me to destroy a feral cat on my sanctuary. You could go to jail for shooting a feral cat. That's the way the law was. So we had to do something about it. And I wore this cat hat, which attracted gradually worldwide attention.
Owning a cat in Australia is the single most damaging environmental thing an Australian can do.
Oh, the cat hat worked, there's no doubt about that. These things weren't done just for fun. They were done, I didn't enjoy doing them. I'd prefer not to have to do them, but sometimes you have to do things to change the law. Because I knew I was sticking my neck out. I got thousands of death threats after that from across the world. In fact, you could tell how far the story had got to from where the death threats were coming from. There was a meeting of environment ministers in Adelaide. They decided to change the law so that you could destroy feral cats on sanctuaries and national parks.
So this is a controversial cat hat. This is what I'm known about. I've done all these wonderful things, and I've done something a bit silly to try and prove something, and that's what I'm remembered for.
Yeah, I get recognised wherever I go because I did cause a stir. I did stir people up. You have to get people motivated.
Well, it was worth it, yes, because you know, there's probably half a dozen species of mammal today that only exist today because of my work, and of course it was worth it. If I'd have died doing it, it would have been worth it.
One of the things that I learnt was it's a lot easier to gain forgiveness than approval.
It's like water coming out of the ground.
I don't do what I can to save biodiversity. I can't sleep at night, but I couldn't give a stuff what people think of me.
With the wind that shook us in our sleep.
Oh, I'm proud of what I did here, yes, and Prue's proud of what we did here. We deserve to be proud of it, and we are, yeah.
The purest of simplicity of creating a 35-acre island in the middle of the Adelaide Hills to give the animals that once lived there a sanctuary is a really honourable, wonderful thing to have done.
This was an extraordinarily successful project, Warrawong, and it was a shame it closed down, but the fact is that it was closed down on purpose. It was closed down because the federal government Department of Environment wanted it closed down because it was embarrassing them. They don't want threats. They couldn't do it publicly, but behind the scenes there was massive attacks on us.
It was very hard to surrender my key to the fence. I had a back door to that place for most of my life, and it was very difficult not to be able to go back there.
Oh, it was miserable. It was sudden. I was at work one day and I was off work the next day, and for me there was a terrific form of period of grieving. And I remember I walk in the mornings, have done for many, many years, and I remember walking past Warrawong one morning. I never did it again. I found a different route, walked a different way, never did it again. But this morning I walked past, and it must have just been the way the wind happened, the smell of the Blackwater Lake, which always had its own smell first thing in the morning or in the evening, just sort of wafted through, and I just burst into tears.
Everyone knows where we've been. Everyone knows, oh, everyone knows. Everyone knows where we've been.
The whole concept was to close down John Walmsley's work, and they nearly succeeded.
There's a secret that I never keep, and a truth I never tell. But I'm living like I mean it, and I think I'm doing well. Cause I've had a fire in my lungs, I've had my back against the wall. I've had reasons for having no reason at all.
I think there was an underestimation of just what impact Warrawong had had.
For me, it was disbelief that the government was essentially dropping up.
South Australians have bid farewell to one of our most loved native wildlife parks. Warrawong Sanctuary has just closed its gates for the last time after entertaining visitors for almost 3 decades.
Hello, I'm David. I'm Narelle. This is Bear. And we've sold everything we own to travel across the country and save a piece of Australia's conservation history.
Yeah, there was times where I have to admit I thought, wow, have we bitten off more than we can chew?
Oh my God.
Kitchen needs refurbishing.
Ugh. It needs a really good paint.
The list is a mile long.
Yeah, there's a bit of work to do.
Why did we buy Warrawong?
I wanted a sanctuary.